Jared, for inviting me. I'm so excited for this program tonight. As mentioned, my name is Ashely Offill, and I'm the Curator of Collections at the Hood Museum of Art, where I spend most of my days trying to make sure that situations like those that you read about in the book do not happen to us here in Hanover, New Hampshire. But in the course of doing that, I also get to read about the ways that it has happened in the past. And so today, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the tools that art professionals use to fight against these types of art crimes, and then go through a few different examples of some of those bad guys that have such exciting stories and sometimes happy endings. And I apologize in advance if I'm clunky with my technology, but I will do my best. So, just to summarize, for those who have either haven't read the book or maybe are still finishing it, as mentioned, this is part of the library's Color Our World Summer Reading Program. And part of what made the main character, the main figure of this book, Stefan Breitweiser, such a successful thief, was his understanding of how the regional museums that surrounded him in France, Austria, and Switzerland and Germany functioned. On the other side of that occasion, of the kind of the equation of the well-educated, kind of well-reasoned thief, are specialists in art crime. Part of what makes art crime so challenging to solve and to prosecute is that there are so many variables involved, which can include things like the values of art and the art market, questions of authenticity, restoration, and conservation, different national and international laws and standards, situations involving individual collectors versus large institutions, not to mention the many different varieties of artwork from every different culture, time period, and location, and all sorts of different media. So, as we'll see, we rely on these kind of common tools to apply to all these individual cases that can shift drastically. So, the people who I'm just going to handily call art crime detectives, which includes, formal formal police and FBI and Interpol, as well as scholars and historians, and even armchair detectives, hone a number of skills that they apply to these different situations that come their way. What I think are the three most effective tools are those that I've listed here on the screen: provenance research, technical analysis, and connoisseurship. So we'll do a brief discussion of what each of those three are, including some examples of how I or my colleagues have used them. And then we'll go through, as I mentioned, a variety of case studies and think about how we would apply these tools to kind of historical instances. So the biggest one is provenance. What is provenance? At its core, its definition is a record of ownership of a work of art or an antique, which can be used as a guide to authenticity or quality. So, ideally, a good provenance record is going to take you from when a work of art was created all the way to the present day with no gaps or holes. Very rarely does that actually exist, especially the older a work of art gets. So a provenance record has to be something that allows for having those kind of gaps and holes that hopefully will be filled in later. Provenance is an important tool because it can demonstrate that something really did come from the hand of the artist or the place of excavation that we believed it to come from. It can also help to establish ownership, right? If you can see the way that things are connected from one person to the next, that can help eliminate some of the questions there might be about who is the ultimate owner of a work of art. They can also tell us things about the lives of the objects themselves. Did they start out in a church and then make their way into private hands and then a museum? Is it something that maybe traveled from different countries? All of this can help us learn more about the work of art. And then, of course, authenticity. If something can be demonstrated coming from a studio of an artist, it is more likely to be a true work of art than something that just popped up on the auction market yesterday. So, how do we figure out provenance? So, we rely a lot on the records of those who come before us. Those can be auction catalogs, those can be object files that are kept in museums, but often we rely on the objects themselves that often bear traces of how they have moved through different owners. Our favorite, I can say, is when they have a nice label on the back that is even in clear English, that tells us exactly what we need to know. So this is the back of a painting that is in the collection at the Hood Museum, which tells us it was part of the collection of Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Jr., so Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. It tells us the name of the painting. It tells us the dimensions of the painting, and it even tells us where it had been displayed before. So all of these details can then be connected to other things, like maybe there's a newspaper about this exhibition, or maybe we have questions about if this painting is the right one or another one, and we can compare the measurements. So a lot of times it's putting pieces of a puzzle together to make sure that they all fit rather than being kind of disjointed. So this one is nice and clear and easy. That's not always the case. Often we need to combine a number of clues of provenance to get to an answer. And one of the things that's really challenging about provenance is that the provenance record is rarely something that is completed. As I mentioned, the older something is, the more likely it is that at some point in its history, either some information that we value today was not recorded at the time, or that information has been lost either through just the kind of impact of time or through nefarious means. And so part of the practice of being a provenance researcher is keeping track of all of the steps in the process so that the next person can pick up where the person before left off. And this is especially important now because we're kind of in a golden age of provenance research, as in the last, 2 decades, but especially in the last 5 years or so, a number of these kinds of records that are really important have become digitized and become accessible without having to go to, this very specific auction house in small town France or the city clerk's office in, small town Missouri. All these things that used to require active boots on the ground kind of problem solving now become more accessible through the kind of digital world. Of course, there are still challenges. Not all databases are digitized. Some things are still kind of kept limited because of cultural restrictions. You still often, as a provenance researcher, have to have really good language skills, especially as you're looking at, for instance, European paintings that often may have been painted in Italy and then gone through France and then maybe through Switzerland before they ended up in the United States. And all of these things, if you don't have the skills, you have to rely on your network of people to help you work through. So here I show you an example of actually another painting in the Hood Museum's collection that I received an inquiry about. I received an inquiry from an employee of the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage of the Republic of Poland. Because they were doing their own provenance research and trying to track down a painting that had once been in the collection of the Museum of King Jan III's palace at Willenau and had been stolen during World War II. So they had an inventory record, which told them the artist's name, Roelof de Vries, which you can see kind of there at the center is on the nameplate of our painting, and the title of the painting, which was Landscape with Ruins. And you can't really read it. If you have really good eyes, you can, but it says Landscape with Ruins on that plaque as well. So when I received this inquiry, I had to go back and see what information we already knew about this painting. So that included some scans of old auction records in our object file, as well as the conservation report from the Williamstown Art Conservation Center, who does conservation for the Hood, that told us a bit about the history of this object, both immediately before it came into our collection and during. Now, what the cultural ministry wanted to know, they asked us for high quality photographs of both the front and the back of the painting. Now, for a provenance researcher, the back of the painting is often much more exciting than the front because it tells us, again, often where it has been. It might have signatures, it might have stamps, it might have different kinds of labels. And what was tricky about this one was that you can see in the top picture there, it had this backing of a material called chloroplast, which is something that conservators put on the back of paintings to help protect the canvas over time from things like dust and bugs. So it's protecting the painting, but it's also keeping us from seeing if anything was back there. Sometimes conservators or curators will mark down in the records if there's something behind that backing, but not always. So what we had to do was physically take that painting out of storage and take that backing off to take a look at it. And what we found was that unfortunately there were no markings here that gave us a clear answer. We also reconfirmed the measurements of the painting because what made this tricky is that Rolf de Vries was an artist who was really prolific. He made a lot of paintings, but a lot of them were these kind of standardized genre scenes that often had generic titles, like Landscape with Ruins. He painted at least 5 of them. So is our Landscape with Ruins the one that Poland was looking for? And by combining the lack of marking on the back and the confirmed dimensions, we were able to confirm that no, this is not the one they were looking for. And so they were able to check it off their list and continue their search. And that is what provenance research sometimes looks like. Um, this wonderful, overwhelming slide is what doing provenance record in the modern day often looks like. As I mentioned, it's become infinitely easier in the contemporary digital age, but it can still be limited. This is 2 pages from the Getty Provenance Index, the Getty Research Institute run system. That is one of the best starting places. But as you can see from the kind of many fields of things to search through, you still have to know a starting place. And often that starting place can give you so many records to work through. But at the same time, you can't be too specific because then you might be limiting what results you get. So just to test this out, I put in Chronic in the artist category there. It was one of the favorite artists of The Thief in our book. And as you can see, there were 1,200 results. Which if I were really trying to find a specific chronic, I might have then combined that with a title word, or maybe if I knew it had gone through a certain country, I might combine it there. What becomes increasingly challenging, of course, is that the way that we describe paintings or categorize them might not be the way that they were described in the 17th century, for instance. We might call something a Madonna and Child, but they might have called it a Virgin and Child, or they might have called it, I don't know, something else. And then that's not even getting into the issue of, do you search in English? Do you search in German? Do you search in French? Thankfully, the Getty Provenance Index does some of that work for you, but still you often want to search multiple times, multiple ways. And that's part of why you want to keep track of all of the different ways that you've searched so that the next person isn't retracing the same steps over and over again. It's hard to read, but you can see some of the types of resources that come up. Getty Provenance Index is especially good because they have a lot of digitized sale catalogs, both from major auction houses, but also smaller independent shops. So it's helpful to see if something has changed hands. Also inventories from both known dealers and individuals going back. They really hit their stride with 17th century material. Anything earlier than that is kind of hard just because the records are different and not digitized in the same way. So as you can see, provenance can be exceptionally helpful as you're trying to figure out where an object has been in its life, but also very challenging. So sometimes it's helpful to start with something you can do with what you have at hand, which is usually the artwork itself. So we frequently use something called technical analysis, which just encompasses a whole lot of things, the use of technology to reveal different aspects of a work of art that are not visible to the naked eye. Often this starts with close looking. You're going to start with just spending time understanding the artwork that you are trying to get more information about. You also start with that close looking because not all technologies and solutions are going to work for every object, depending on what it's made of, maybe changes that have been made to it. So I've included here a few examples of common techniques. Again, like I said, they're often helping us look at layers that are not visible to the naked eye, either because they're the preparatory layers, they were never meant to be seen. Sometimes they're not visible because of varnish that's been applied later that can sometimes change, become really yellow or dark, so you can't see what's going on underneath. Or even sometimes evidence of conservation or restoration that's happened after the fact. We can also see sometimes changes to the surface. So things like canvases that have had wax linings applied to the back, which then often flattens the surface of the paint. You can see things like cusping, which are these particular kind of curved cracks that happen around the edges of paintings when they have been re-stretched. So they might have gone loose over time and they've been reconformed to their frame. Or things like crackliture, the actual pattern of cracks that happens both naturally and when something that we affectionately call an impact event happens, when, either someone or something runs into a painting and you get a radiating kind of ring of cracks that comes out from that. So we often start with something called raking light, which is something that anyone can do. You take a strong light and put it at an oblique angle, and that helps you see different qualities of the texture of the surface. Sometimes that can highlight brushwork, it can highlight cracks and damage. Um, it is often a good starting place to get a sense of what is happening. Some of the other kind of common imaging related techniques we use are infrared imaging, which is desirable because it's non destructive, right? It doesn't impact the work of art to have an infrared image taken. It can show details underneath the upper layers of paint. And it works by recording the visible absorption and, sorry, the variable absorption and reflection of infrared light, which means it can penetrate below the surface, and it also especially reacts with charcoal and carbon-based pigments. So things like if you're creating a painting and you have a sketch that you're doing with charcoal and then you cover it over with oil paint, infrared is going to show you that charcoal sketch as if it is there, you know, no problem. Don't have to remove any of the paint to see it. UV light is another one, and we see an example of UV light in that first image towards the middle there, also non-destructive. And that creates a fluorescence that reacts differently to different materials. So you can see kind of a variety of different vague glows, but also areas where it's really deep and dark, where it's not shining. And so if you kind of learn how to read the different materials, that can help you know, oh, so those dark areas are often much later varnishes that are added that don't shine as brightly as the older ones, for instance. It can also sometimes show us underpainting. It shows us restoration. So, for instance, these little spots along the two bottom corners are where the leaves around those cupids have been repainted over time. So it's later paint. So the trick about a lot of these techniques is it tells you things, but you have to know how to decode the images. And often that requires working with a conservator who's really trained in these methods. We also often use microscopic analysis, so things like fiber analysis, which can tell you if it's, for instance, cotton versus linen canvas. You can also take a small cross section of paint and look at that under a microscope, and that can tell you what the kind of preparatory layer is made of, what the pigment looks like, if there's a varnish over the top. That one is not used in every situation because it does require taking a small bit of paint away, but it can be as small as the head of a pin. So doing that kind of cross-section work can be helpful. X-ray, which is what we see on the far side there, is another handy tool. It makes use of the fact that different materials can absorb or transmit different amounts of radiation, which also changes based on how those materials are applied. So if something is really thickly applied, that'll look different in the X-ray versus a thin application of that same paint. And X-ray is often used to show damage to a painting, to show if canvas has been reused. So if there's kind of two layers of paintings, how paint has been applied. If there's changes in composition, X-ray is really great if, say, Rembrandt is painting a head and then decides, instead of that head up here, I want it to be down here. X-ray will show you the old one that he's painted over just up there, especially because when it comes to a lot of these older artists, they're using at their base a lead white. And so that is going to react really strongly when you're using your X-ray. Another more recent development is the use of X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, which can be used to define the elemental composition of an area it's pointed at. So for instance, if I were to point it at this painting here, it would tell me not so much what color that pigment is or how that pigment was applied, but instead that pigment was made up of 40% of this mineral and 50% of this mineral and 2% of this mineral. that can then give us a sense of, again, what people are using to create their materials. It can be really helpful when it comes to metal sculpture because it can tell you the exact composition of an alloy, so a combination of different types of metallic ore. And that can often be linked to specific geographic locations. So, for instance, you could get a certain composition that, oh, that type of ore is usually used in 19th century France. And so they are saying it's from 16th century Italy. That's probably not true. Um, and so XRF is kind of a new tool in the toolkit. There are many more, and they can be applied differently and in combination. What's challenging is that forgers also know these techniques, and they're constantly evolving their practice to try and fool them. And we'll see a few examples of that as we move on. Doing this kind of analysis is also really expensive and time consuming. So not every institution or individual can do it. There usually has to be a very specific reason, whether that's conservation or deep research, or you think something is a fake. To give you a few examples from the Hood's collection, here is an object currently on view in the galleries, a early Roman ewer made of bronze, which the question that we had, curators kind of heard there before me, was, is this an actual ancient Roman piece? And is it actually Roman? Because there's some question about where in the world it had come from. So what they did first was they took a number of x-rays, which you can see in the upper portion there, which told us a bit about how the body and the shape of the ewer had been changed over time, including that the handle had really significantly kind of shifted. But what's really important is the kind of really confusing lovely graph that you see at the bottom there, which was the result of lead isotope dating, which can be used to identify the age and possible origins of that material. So what this does is it analyzes the ratio of the lead isotopes and how much they degrade, and it can function like a fingerprint. So specific lead isotopes are tied to specific locations. And so what we see here is that with some degree of certainty, it's hard to see, but there are little, okay, maybe I should show up. So little kind of stars right here, which is where our ewer occupied, which told us that, yeah, this was, probably located from where we thought it was. And again, can't tell just by looking at this where the metal came from, but by comparing it to this graph and this testing, we are able to see that we could confidently say that it was the Roman ewer. Now, another kind of more visually fun example is this one with a recent acquisition of a reliquary bust, which we acquired but had questions about, is there still a reliquary? Or sorry, is there still a relic inside of this reliquary bust? Because unlike some busts, it doesn't have a clear panel. You couldn't see inside of it. It's not hinged. We didn't want to take it apart. And thankfully, we were able to collaborate with other folks at Dartmouth, specifically at Dartmouth Hitchcock, to make use of a new CT machine that they needed to have tested. So we took our lovely reliquary to the oncology wing and put her through the CT. So you can see there my colleague Beth Madison and our former registrar, Lauren Silverman, getting her ready for her CT scan. And then one of the doctors deciphering the results for us. Now, a CT scan, as you may know from medical reasons, provides a three-dimensional image of an internal structure, and it gives you different qualities based on the densities of the materials. So our question, is there a relic inside the reliquary? And if so, where was it? Was answered, there is no relic inside. Yay, that's what we want to hear. And that relic would have been stored inside of her head. So there was a kind of, unfortunately you can't see an image, but there was a kind of hole that went from the crown of her head down through that would have once held the relic. But it told us some other really interesting things as well, because since CT scanning measures different densities, we were able to see that she's made actually of different planks of wood, one of which was kind of a better quality wood and one of which was a poorer quality wood, which supported our assumption that this was a reliquary that was made kind of to be purchased off the shelf, rather than one that was kind of made on spec. And also that there is a layer of chalk underneath the painted surface, which is a particular way of preparing the surface that was particularly done in the region of Tyrol and Swabia. that told us that rather than this kind of general German area we thought she was from, that we could give her a more specific location based on the materials we found. So that was a really exciting and fun exploration to be able to do. We were making a lot of very excited noises, and everyone kept checking in to see what was happening in this oncology lab. And it was we were scanning a reliquary bust. So the last term I'm going to talk about, the last tool is connoisseurship, which is a bit of a tricky term. It comes from the French word connoisseur, which means an expert or judge, and the Latin conoscere, which means to get to know. And so someone who practices connoisseurship is someone who has spent a long amount of time getting to know a very specific subject. So in an art context, it is someone who has an intense expertise in, for instance, a particular artist or a particular artist's school. They spent a lot of time looking and studying and just have this kind of internal Rolodex of things that they know. And so if they are confronted with a new painting by that artist, they're able to kind of make a case for why it should be by the same artist or not, as the case may be. And this is often used to help identify unattributed paintings, to authenticate paintings that maybe aren't signed but people think are by a specific artist. I say paintings, it could be sculptures, it could be ceramics, it could be any type of art media, and often is used in conversation with things like the historical context. Now, the example that is often jokingly given of a good connoisseur is someone who is able to identify a painting by Leonardo da Vinci by looking at how the ear is depicted, which kind of pokes fun of the fact that for so long connoisseurship was about these intense, heightened details, which in some cases is true. But really, connoisseurship is at its core about that looking closely, about practicing comparison. It still is quite controversial because for a long time, connoisseurship was perceived as being very elitist, in part because of the people who championed the technique. And if you're going to be a connoisseur in the early days of art history, if you're going to look at a lot of things to create these mental comparisons, you're going to have to travel a lot. You're going to have access to a lot of places. You're going to have leisure time to go and do all of this thing. So it's a particular type of person who often became the connoisseur. And so there's still kind of this often knee-jerk reaction to being called a connoisseur in this day and age. But in reality, it's a tool just like any other. And especially now in the digital age, it is much easier to look at a lot of art without even necessarily leaving your living room. Rembrandt is a really great example of connoisseurship. At one point in the 19th century, there were over 1,000 paintings that were attributed to Rembrandt. But through a dedicated project called the Rembrandt Research Project that ran from 1968 to 2014, they slowly whittled away at those over 1,000 paintings. Now only about 350 paintings are identified as truly by Rembrandt. And this is one of the paintings here that is now identified as Circle of Rembrandt rather than by Rembrandt himself. However, while it's easy to say that, oh, we have lost all of these paintings that we once thought to be by this great master painter, we've also gained a lot through this process. One of the things we've learned is other artists, people who are students, people who are apprentices, who are working in a studio, who now, not in this case, unfortunately, but otherwise are named artists, named makers who are able to have their own body of artwork that is connected to Rembrandt, but they don't have to be given Rembrandt's name anymore. We've also learned a lot about the way that he worked. This might be something that is unusual to think about in today's age, where often we think of an individual single artist as genius who's responsible for creating the entire work from beginning to end. But for so much of art history, and even today, that wasn't the case. It was, an artist who was working with a workshop, a studio, with apprentices who would share the responsibility. Often the artist would create the design, the master artist would create the design, would have the main plan, who would be responsible for the commission. But wouldn't paint the entire thing or wouldn't sculpt the entire thing. That would be shared. Often, the kind of master of the workshop would do faces, often hands, things that are particularly expressive or individual. But all that busy work of the background and the fabric and the setting was often many other artists. And this was just known and accepted. This brings us to, bigger questions of what does it mean for a painting to be a Rembrandt? How much of Rembrandt does there need to be to call something a Rembrandt? That's a naughty subject. We won't get into that one. But this issue of connoisseurship is one that uses the paintings themselves to try and solve that question. And so in this case, this was a painting that was categorized to be as by Rembrandt himself for years. They even believed that the sitter was his brother. But in 1984, doubts were raised and confirmed the year later that it was probably being painted by one of his students based on elements of style that didn't match with what people knew of Rembrandt. You might especially look at the way the face is depicted and the different methods of blending the colors there, which are still very skilled, but not exactly the way that we'd see Rembrandt's approach. But there's often this drive to have things by the single great known artist, one who goes for millions of dollars. And so you see something that's like, ooh, dark background, stern face, rich material, that's Rembrandt. And then sometimes it's the backtracking to kind of see what that really is. So to give you an example of connoisseurship, oops, my little animation did not work here. So I was going to say, to test your skills, does anyone have any guesses about who artist created this painting? But my answer is already next to you if you know this other painting to the side here. So this is a painting here on the left that is at the Hood Museum of Art. That is indeed attributed to John Singer Sargent, the famous painter of Madame X, which we see to the side there. As may be clear, there have long been questions about that attribution. It does not look like what most people would expect of a Sargent. And so here we're going to run into the issue where my animations are going to be wonky. So just excuse my attempts to make this not weird. Okay, so here's the painting. So it is by John Singer Sargent. It is meant to be after another artist from his travels in Italy. It's a painting of St. Jerome, St. Roch, and St. Sebastian. This is a painting that myself and our curator of American art, Michael Hartman, have long been curious about. In our database and in the catalog Raisonné, which is the definitive catalog of works by an artist, this is identified as a painting by Sargent. However, it does not look at all like a Sargent. It doesn't have the same lightness of brushwork and color that one would expect from the master portrait painter. We took advantage of the fact that the Hood had conservators on site for a workshop a few years ago, and we took it down. We looked at it closely using a lot of the techniques we talked about, raking light, none of the other kind of more intensive ones yet. We did look at some things under a microscope. We looked at brushwork, application of paint, use of color, even the type of canvas. And then we also, again, took off the backing that was here and looked at what was on the back. And like the previous example, there's a lot of things on the back. What might be most tempting, of course, is the giant J.S. Sargent on the back. But comparing that to known photographs of the artist's signature, it seems that that was a later addition by someone else who wanted to really firmly tie this to Sargent, but was not added at the time of the creation. What was more kind of tempting and enticing were all these different labels we see at the top. Some of these are price labels, some of these are places that's been displayed. Some of these are the one at the top, the Galbos is a framer from the United States who presumably framed this. But the most exciting one, which now I'm going to drag back in here, is this one, which you can barely read, but this is a label for Giuseppe Bazzuti, who was a retail artist supplier and print seller in Venice. They were one of the two artist suppliers who were listed in Venice in John Murray's 1897 Handbook for Travelers in Northern Italy. And we know from comparison to other works by Sargent that he did purchase materials from this shop. So that is really tempting. It's really promising. The date of the painting and the date of other paintings that are known to use this support all line up. So if we're looking at the connoisseurship, doesn't match, does not look like Sargent. If we look at the provenance, that seems to tell us it is Sargent. So this really highlights that often you can't use these tools in isolation, you have to combine them. And so we're actually still waiting and hoping to do technical analysis on this, which will hopefully again show us some of those underlayers and things that might kind of resolve this question once and for all. And it's an exciting kind of puzzle that we're still working through at the hood, just down the road. So moving on now for this last bit, just to talk about some case studies, thinking about what tools you would use to solve the crime. And again, my animation's not going to work, so you're going to know the answer already. I was going to ask you which painting was by Vermeer. But as you can see, one is already very nicely labeled fake. But this is a fascinating story of a man named Han van Metergren, who was a forger of Vermeer's. An art historian named Abraham Britius was approached by a lawyer who said he was a representative of a Dutch family estate who shared this painting, the one we see here, the Supper at Emmaus, who then published an article that said, "It's a wonderful moment in the life of a lover of art when he finds himself suddenly confronted with a hitherto unknown painting by a great master, untouched on the original canvas and without any restoration, just as it left the painter's studio. And what a picture! Neither the beautiful signature nor the pointels on the bread, which Christ is blessing, are necessary to convince us we have here, I'm inclined to say, the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft. Quite different from all his other paintings, and yet every inch of Vermeer." Now, for those of you who know Vermeer, you would agree this is very different from the Vermeer that we know and love. The girl with the pearl earring, a lot of his views of interiors filled with beautiful light and detail. So the question is, how were Britius and many others in the art world fooled by this painting? For one, Van Meergren played on the art market's desire to find lost artworks by creating fake Vermeers that would have been from early in his career, so while he was potentially still developing his style, and also that featured religious subjects, which Vermeer rarely painted. So this kind of felt like you're filling a gap, this new discovery that then was kind of re-shifting what we knew about the artist. Technically, Van Meergren also, like many other forgers, started with an actual painting from the time period of Vermeer. After he removed what was originally painted on that canvas surface, he was left with something that could fool techniques like carbon dating, because it was a 17th century canvas, and also carried with it some of the tension that would recreate those cracks that help us know if something is truly old. He also mixed his own pigments from the same materials used by 17th century artists like Vermeer, including cinnabar, lead white, and lapis lazuli, and made his own badger hair paintbrushes so that any of those little, strands left behind would be, again, from the art period instead of like an acrylic or something like that. Where his real innovation came in was when it came to making his oil paints hard. Because if you've ever worked with oil paint or have been around a newly painted oil paint, you know that they stay quite mushy for a while, for like 50 years sometimes. It takes a long time for oil paint to dry. And so what he did was he mixed his pigment with a synthetic resin that was basically like Bakelite. So you think of Bakelite, the jewelry, the plastic, material. He mixed that with his pigment and then physically baked the paintings so that they hardened. He then applied pressure onto that baked canvas to create cracks and washed it with India ink so that black went into those cracks. And suddenly he has a painting that passes a lot of the tests that we talked about at the beginning of the day today. So they actually did test these. They did lead white analysis, they did X-ray, they did microscope analysis, and all of these seemed to be authentic Vermeers. So the question is then, why was he caught? And it wasn't because his paintings came under question, but because he gave himself up to save himself from a more serious crime. In May 1945, he was arrested and charged with conspiring with the enemy for selling what was believed to be an authentic Vermeer to the Nazi Field Marshal Hermann Göring. Since the crime of collaboration with Nazis was punishable by death, Van Meergren presented an unusual defense. He said that the Vermeer that he supposedly sold was actually a forgery that was painted by Van Meergren himself, And then, since Goring had given Van Meergen 200 original Dutch paintings in exchange for that fake Vermeer, Van Meergen had actually saved art from the Nazis and should be celebrated. So he was very creative. The photo that we see on the opposite side there is actually part of the trial proceedings because no one could believe that he had fooled the art world for so long. And so, as part of the trial, he actually painted another Vermeer in front of the jury by camera, using the same materials and techniques. And so that's what you see him doing there. Ultimately, he was only sentenced to a year in jail. He made the equivalent of millions of dollars. Many of his fake Vermeers went into prestigious collections. They created implications of other Vermeers being added so that the kind of a number of Vermeers that were believed to be true exploded. There's 35 known Vermeers. There were upwards of 60 when Van Meergen was working. Though he was only sentenced to a year in jail, he did die of a heart attack in prison only 1 month into his sentence. So he is, again, probably a master forger, because not only did he fool people with his paintings, but he fooled them with paintings that honestly look nothing like real Vermeers. I'm going to shift us now to someone who's a bit on the other side of the spectrum. Van Meergen argued that he made his forgeries for the sake of art, which may sound familiar to our thief from the book that we read. But in reality, Van Meergen was really hoping to fool the elitist art world who had rejected him as an independent artist and also trying to make a lot of money. But other forgers had less lofty goals. Our next forger, Thomas Herbert, the 8th Earl of Pembroke, might actually not be described as a forger by many people. He was a collector of antiquities in the 18th century, had a huge collection of ancient and modern sculptures at his home in Wilton Hall in Wiltshire. He was very much part of the intellectual life of the day. He was a president of the Royal Society, friends of intellectuals such as Jonathan Smith and John Locke. And he collected especially ancient Greek and Roman sculpture to try and create this encyclopedic collection of history that could connect to his education, his literature. He didn't want any duplicates. He wanted as many representations of the Greek and Roman gods as possible. He wanted things that had inscriptions most specifically, and he wanted to focus on what was the best. Unfortunately, the way he went about building his collection did not really result in the best. He had many bulk purchases, including remnants of other people's collections, where he was kind of just like wholesale buying all of these antiquities, many of which, maybe got to a port and then were too expensive to ship to England. He said, sure, I'll cover that cost. And he just gets a huge boatload of sculpture, which thankfully he had a very large house to fill. His collection was a mix of real antiquities and creations, quote, after the antique, some of which were known at the time to be so, but he believes that they were all real. Here, we can see both a photograph of the interior of Wilton Hall and then the frontispiece of a 1752 comic play that made fun of collectors and was loosely based on Earl of Pembroke. They were given names like Lord Dupe and Sir Positive Babble. One of the quotes from that play says, I ne'er for trinkets rack my pericranium, they furnish out my room from Herculaneum. So the huge appetite that he had for his collection led to questionable choices, falling victim to the thriving industry of forgers in Italy and Greece. There are some really fascinating contemporary quotes from people who visited Wilton Hall, including in 1759, Horace Walpole wrote, I have lately been at Wilton and was astonished by the heaps of rubbish. The house is grand and the place glorious, but I should shovel 3 parts of the marbles and pictures into the river. There was also an anonymous letter to Oxford Magazine in 1772 that said the late Earl of Pembroke was extravagantly fond of and thought himself a great connoisseur in antiques. But after his death, there were found at the bottom of one of his ponds a great number of statues which he purchased as antiques and which he afterward found were fabricated by moderns, buried in the earth and afterward dug up as if by accident. So he did fall victim to kind of the most common scheme, of course, which was to make something that looked old, bury it so that it looked even more old, and then sell it to a gullible tourist. we actually have one of the sculptures. I'm going to move it. So here, one of the sculptures from Thomas Herbert's collection at the hood. If I can get this out of the way so you can see the whole thing. Nope. You can kind of see it if I hold it over here. It is a sarcophagus fragment, which is one of his favorite categories of artwork. It is carved in marble. As far as we know and what we can tell, this is one of the true antiquities, so this was a good one. But it has something interesting, which demonstrates one of the quirks of the Earl of Pembroke, namely that he would often alter his sculptures if they didn't have an inscription to put an inscription on it to, again, make it look even more old. So as described by a recent biographer, insofar as he did have a collecting strategy, it was to represent aspects of the ancient world as comprehensively as possible, particularly through images of all the most famous Greeks and Romans. He did not set out to shop for them, but the names were retrospectively imposed on the sculptures quite literally by the addition of inscribed labels in the marble or on pedestals. The inscriptions are sometimes so crude that one suspects the Earl of executing them with his own hand. The identifications are often entirely arbitrary and so rarely accurate that the correct names that do exist may merely be lucky accidents. So, while most people would not say that Thomas Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, was a active forger, he definitely was still kind of fudging the truth a little bit, and shows that sometimes something as simple as a name or an inscription can radically change how we understand a work of art. Now, to get us to the close, of course, one of the largest kind of mass instances of looting of the modern era is the looting that took place with Nazis in World War II. During World War II, the Nazis had an organized program that began with and focused on seizing Jewish property, but also encompassed the cultural heritage of Nazi occupied territories. Hitler, who of course was himself a failed artist, and many of his lieutenants considered themselves connoisseurs of art, but their taste favored old masters, particularly German artists or Germanic artists, and they particularly hated modern art. They were seizing art to hopefully create a state museum in Linz, Austria, but also for private collections of Nazi officers. They took major art collections from Jewish families such as the Rothschilds, Rosenbergs, and Schloss families, and other families and dealers were forced to sell under duress. Their collections were taken from museums, churches, and other institutions within occupied lands. During the war, stolen artworks were often stockpiled in safe locations, ready to be enjoyed after the war and the assumed Nazi victory. Many of the artworks were stored in salt mines in Germany and Austria that had the proper humidity and temperature conditions for artwork, and that's what the photo on our right here shows. They also had the benefit, the mines, of being safe from Allied bombing raids. After the war, over 1,500 repositories of artworks were discovered that had been squirreled away by the Nazis. And we can see, of course, Hitler himself admiring some of the spoils there. Now, as we know, this does have a happy if bittersweet ending, and that the Allies did triumph, and that involved also returning the art as best as possible. So the main recovery efforts took place through the Allies Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, or the MFAA, which are most commonly known as the Monuments Men and Women. The Allies would collect artworks and move them to different collecting points, especially the central collecting point in Munich, where they could begin the work of identifying the artworks and where they had been looted from. For the most part, because there were such significant numbers, what they had to do was identify the country that the artwork had been taken from, and then send a kind of big batch back to, France, back to Italy, and then trust that country to redistribute the objects to where they were meant to go, whether that was to a public institution or to a family. Though in many cases that didn't happen, often due to the struggles that many of these countries were facing after the war, the challenges of attempting to return artworks to families that had been completely decimated in concentration camps. And so this kind of restitution, this relocation of artworks that had been looted by the Nazis is an ongoing project. So here we see one of those repositories of loot that was actually in a church. And here again in the salt mines, we see the Ghent altarpiece being unpacked by some GIs. So Nazi provenance is probably one of the best developed areas of provenance work because there is such a drive to right this wrong where possible. And in some ways, it's the most straightforward in terms of process. There have been a number of resources developed. The monuments men and women kept meticulous records where they could. And in a lot of cases, the Nazis did too, because they wanted to be able to track down the art after the war and they thought they were going to win. So we see here a photograph of that central collecting point where things have been gathered. Here is one of the cards that identifies one of the paintings, but you can see why this could be just as challenging as having no information. So this is a painting that tells us it is by Van Dyck, so Anthony Van Dyck, that it is a Holy Trinity. There are probably a lot of paintings of Holy Trinities. That it is, let's see, oil on canvas, again, very common. Its condition is good, slightly damaged. And then we have a section for the presumed owner. Now, if this, let's see, another key thing here is it has the measurements. In my provenance section, I talked about how important comparing the measurements is, and that's part of this, right? That, there might be 15 paintings of the Holy Trinity by Van Dyck, but often they'll have slightly different measurements, maybe a slightly different origin location, and that can help identify the specific one. In 1998, the Washington Principles were established that told us that if the pre-war owners of art that have been found to be confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted could be identified, steps should be taken to achieve a just and fair solution, recognizing this may vary based on the facts and circumstances of a specific case. And so that means that museums are often investigating their collections to look for artworks that fit a certain set of criteria. Something that was created before 1956. So if it was made after World War II, it could not have been stolen by Nazis. If it had a change of ownership between 1932 and 1946. If it was believed to be on continental Europe within the same dates. So again, if there's something that we know has been in the United States since 1904, again, odds are that it wasn't stolen by Nazis. But then also looking for a connection with known entities. And so that leads us to another example. Moving us along, this is another piece of the Hood's collection. It's attributed to an artist named Franz Zacherle. It is Pygmalion and Galatea with Venus. It's a lovely pearwood relief that was recently on view. And this is what the provenance record looked like just 4 years ago. Do any things there bring red flags when you look at things and might go, I want to look at that a little more closely? Yes.
Passed away in 44.
Yeah, so our first guy here passed away in 44. That is right in the midst of the war. That could tell us, okay, wonder when and where and how that person died. Anything else? Something that I look at is when you have those gaps in dates. And so you'll see at the first we have before 1938, and then we jump all the way to 1998. So there's a big lump of missing time there. So those are two of the big red flags that I would look for. And you can see, so my colleague Beth Madison spent a long time doing research on this and was actually able to enhance that provenance record. And those instincts were correct about the person, about the time period. Oscar Bondy was an Austrian Jewish business owner and art collector who lived in Vienna. And while he escaped to Switzerland and ultimately immigrated to the United States, his collection was seized in 1938. His widow, after he passed away, so he passed away completely unrelated to the war, but the timing was still apt. So his widow, Elizabeth, fought to have the 2,000 looted pieces of his collection returned. And we can see that that did take place here. So in this case, the relief was confiscated. It was specifically going to this major museum in Linz, Austria. It was then recovered by the monuments men and then eventually restituted to his widow, Elizabeth Bondy, who then was able to make the decision about what happened. And she ultimately did sell it to New York-based dealers, the Blumkas. Then it kind of worked its way through until it was sold to the Hood Museum. And so this is a great example of what good provenance research looks like and what the results are. What is tricky is that doing this one object took about 8 months of solid work. And so you think about the kind of huge amount of artworks that need research, even if we're just talking about Nazi era provenance, it's challenging. Not all museum workers or curators are trained in provenance research or have the skills to do that. And there are only, I think, eight dedicated provenance curators in the United States. It's still very much a growing field. I think we'll see that changing in the next few decades. But part of what museums are confronting is there's just a big backlog and hard to do it. So we kind of pick away where we can. So there are, of course, very well-known stories of Nazi art theft and restitution. Perhaps the most well-known is the case of the woman in gold, which is the subject of a book and a movie with Helen Mirren, which centered around a painting by Gustav Klimt of Allée Bloch-Bauer, which was stolen by Nazis in 1938. Rather than it being returned to the family after the war, it hung in the Austrian National Gallery, where it was listed as bequeathed to the institution. However, in reality, Adelaide's husband, Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, had left his estate to his nieces and nephews, one of which, Marie Altman, who we see pictured there with the painting, led a long court case that ultimately led to the painting being returned to Maria and the family, brought to the United States, and ultimately installed in the new gallery in New York City. Just to give another maybe less known example that has a slightly different result, here on the side we see the painting J.W. Turner's Glaucus and Scylla, which was owned by the Jewish art collectors Anna and John Jeffe until it was seized in 1943 and sold at an auction of, quote, Jewish property. After the war, it moved through the art market until it was sold to the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas in 1966, where it stayed until 2005. At that time, as is the case with many cases of Nazi-era restitution, a family member was trying to search down what had happened to their family's property and were able to find a reference to this painting. They reached out to the Kimball in 2005. There were negotiations between the museum and the family, and the Kimball did agree to return the painting to the family. Then the family decided that they were going to auction the painting, which happened in 2007 in Christie's. This often happens when it's multiple heirs in a single object. It's easier to split money than a painting. And this had, in reality, kind of a perfect ending for all involved, because then the Kimball repurchased the painting and it still hangs in their galleries today. And it's funny because this all happened in 2007. And as mentioned, I was an undergraduate at Texas Christian University and started there right around that time and knew nothing of this history. But it is a painting that I did much love looking at the Kimball there. So one last kind of present day case, theft at the British Museum. And in contrast to maybe what you might expect, which is the British Museum stealing other things, this was things stolen from the British Museum. Between 2009 to 2018, over 1,800 items were taken from the storerooms of the Greek and Roman collection, mostly small items like coins, jewelry, and cameos. This went unnoticed in a collection of over 8 million items, which as a curator of collections, I don't know what I would do with 8 million items. 70,000 is more than enough for me. And part of the challenge is that there are several million in their collection that were not fully cataloged. So it's easy for things to slip away when they didn't have a document trail behind them. And in some cases, it seems that the thief actually edited the records for things that disappeared, because in this case, it was a thief from inside. It was a curator at the British Museum. In fact, the senior curator of the Greek and Roman department, Peter Higgs, who was accused of the theft, which came to light when an antiquities dealer who had a photographic memory saw one of the British Museum's coins, which we see at the center there, offered for sale on eBay. So Peter Higgs had been selling these pieces on eBay, often for just, 40 to 60 pounds. He was not making the value of these. He was not making enough to live on off of this. It is still unknown why he was doing this. He was well regarded at the museum, was a celebrated curator. He was fired a month before the thefts were made public. He denies the allegations to this day, and the British Museum sued him, and the case is ongoing. So I guess we will see. And as you can see, there's a whole website on the British Museum's website because they are still trying to find their lost items. So they've recovered at this date about 600 of them. So again, maybe about a third of what's gone missing. And it is likely that they will not get a lot of it back. So as you can see, there are a lot of different aspects of crime in the art world, from the kind of minuscule and inconsequential to the big and scary and frightening. And of course, this is a great subject for a lot of books. So here are a few more in this genre that I have quite enjoyed. If you want to know more about Van Meegeren and his forging of Vermeers, I first learned about it in this book, The Forger's Spell. You can also learn about the people who collect art. If you've read The Monuments Men already, but haven't read about Italy specifically, that one is great. And then to branch us out from art a bit, The Feather Thief is a story of someone who steals from a natural history museum. And again, in ways that you cannot believe went undetected for so long. So I know that I spent more time talking at you than giving you time for questions, but I'm happy to take questions, comments, all of those things. And I hope you enjoyed this kind of journey through the underworld of the art world with me. Yes.
You had mentioned that the woman in gold wound up with the Noy Gallery.
Yes.
That's because Ronald Lauder bought it for $135 million.
Yes, he did. Yeah, and so that's something that we also see is that there are huge dollar values associated with these, both because of the value of the artwork, but then also the notoriety they get often increases their value. Yes.
You didn't talk a lot about items that were stolen that have never been found, except for here at the end. But I am curious about the paintings that were taken from the gardener.
Yeah.
Yeah. What? Yeah. What? At what point is that investigation? I mean, what they've done? What have they done? And is it stopped right now on hold?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a section on the gardener originally, and I took it out. I was like, oh, everyone's from the area. They know it backwards and forwards. And it's a great question because I think a lot of people think once a certain amount of time passes, especially something like those paintings that are so singular and easy to identify, that if they were going to reappear, they would have reappeared by now. Um, but the reality is also that one of the primary or kind of motivations behind art theft is the ability to use art as a collateral for um, what's the word I want looking for? Collateral for people in the underworld, for people who are able to, rather than paying millions of dollars for a new shipment of machine guns for a terrorist organization, will instead offer a painting which has a certain amount of value. So it functions. It's like art is the poker chip of the underworld. And so I think there is a hope that some of these kind of big, highly valuable artworks that have been stolen and are lost are just kind of navigating in that underworld. Often it's not even a physical transfer. They stay in one storage location, and just the kind of title of ownership goes back and forth. So there's a hope that, if Interpol cracks the case and finds that storage unit, that they might still find, for instance, the Gardner paintings. So hope is not completely lost. I think that in a lot of situations, they are treated like cold cases, right? The file is there. They aren't actively investigating. But if there's a tip, if there's something new, and like with the new Netflix documentary, for instance, it kind of opens the possibility that someone new might say something. So I don't think they're ever completely given up on, but because there are so few art crime specialists in so many cases, I think at a certain point they have to move on to what's kind of the most active case. I don't know. I would like to hope that those paintings will be found, but it's also a hard world out there for an old painting that's not in a frame anymore. So, yeah.
Wasn't one of the pictures recovered recently?
From the gardener?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
From some gallery in New York, maybe?
That's quite possible. Like, things are recovered fairly often. We see this with things that are stolen from galleries, things that have gone missing and then turn up in an auction record. So it does happen. Yeah. I think if it's something from the gardener, it'll be top of the news cycle for ages. But no, it definitely happens. Yeah.
Are there advances? The AI is advancing. So the technology is advancing so fast.
Yeah.
So quickly. I wonder whether or not you see in any of that the ability to maybe bridge the provenance gap, for example. Are there trends in that field that
Mhm.
speak to the possibility of addressing some of these bottlenecks?
I think it's possible. I think if you're able to kind of train the AI, one of the biggest roadblocks that, you know, I can say I've experienced is I focus especially on like 16th, 17th century things, is just deciphering the handwriting, right? It takes a long time to work through a single inventory sheet. And there have been various tools that have been kind of developed and worked on to be able to have computing do some of that work so that rather than, you know, this scribal hand from the 17th century have a nice, you know, Word document that lists them. I think that's the first area where we see a possibility. I know there have been suggestions of using AI in working towards authenticity as well, right? That it kind of does it becomes a connoisseur, right, of an artwork
Yeah.
and then does the combination. As you might expect, there's a lot of people who say a machine can never know for real if it is, you know, a true Van Gogh or whatever it is. So I think yes, we'll see AI used. The question is how effectively and how ethically. Yeah.
I remember back in the 1980s, I think it was, when Monet's Impression Sunrise was stolen.
Yes.
And I remember at the time the case went cold, and the theory was that the painting had made its way to Asia.
Yeah.
And at the time, they were saying that there was no kind of extradition with
Yes.
Japan. And so I'm just wondering if that landscape has changed. Is there more of a universal commitment or cooperation, or is it still pretty tricky if some paintings end up in other countries?
It has changed, but not completely. So there are definitely it changes with the political landscape, right? Who wants to be friends and who wants to work together. So there are places, countries that artwork can go, and even if it's found there, it's not going to be returned. You're going to have a hard time getting through the courts. So yes and no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would say it is better, is more likely, and especially like that's part of why things like the Washington principles are so important because that does set a certain kind of legal boundary for people to adhere to. You see this especially if something is part of UNESCO's different kind of regulations. That often has a lot of weight with the UN or different international bodies. But yeah, it's still a challenge.
And on Zoom is asking, are museums obligated to check out the provenance before they accept donations? Any code of ethics?
So I will say that the hood is, yes. And I would say that most museums in the United States, at least those who are accredited, so those who are kind of gone through a certain process of becoming following best practices, that is part of the best practice they are required to, that they have these really strict accessioning guidelines that include checking the provenance. What becomes challenging is what checking the provenance means is so variable that sometimes it's just like some museums who are maybe abiding by the letter of the law, but not the ethics of the situation would say, yeah, I checked it against the art loss register and nothing came up and that's all I needed to do, versus maybe there's other more kind of strenuous things that you could do, but they've decided that, you know, they checked the box and they've checked it. And so who knows? That is not the same internationally. So every different country is going to have different rules. If you're not an accredited museum, if you're a private collector, you are not necessarily held to those same guidelines. And that is something that is increasingly changing in the United States, at least, that more and more places are both saying that they will really thoroughly investigate provenance and they actively will not accept things if they either have questionable or no provenance. And often the cutoff line is 1970 because of those UNESCO guidelines.
Do museums carry insurance for this kind of ill happening?
Yes, yes, they do, which is often one of the great expenses of a museum budget. For us, we are part of Dartmouth's insurance, so that benefits us. But yeah, it covers, you know, things like floods and fires, but also things like theft and damage by visitors. And so fine arts insurance is one of the pricier insurance policies that you can have. And it's also part of accreditation. So it all comes back. people have more questions, I'm always across the street at the Hood Museum. I also put my email address down there. But thank you all for being a great audience, for humoring me and staying a few minutes longer with your questions. And I hope that you enjoyed reading the book as much as I did.